welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Technology and Memory, Why Nobody Gives a Crap Anymore. The laws of memory are subject to the more general laws of habit. Habit is a compromise effected between the individual and his environment, or between the individual and his own organic eccentricities, the guarantee of a dull inviolability, the lightning conductor of his existence. Habit is the ballast that chains the dog to his vomit. Hi everybody. And if you look at all the YouTube tutorials on how to get the most numbers for the algorithm, I think it says to, start off with a nice welcoming tone. So the idea of a dog chained to its own vomit, I thought would be a nice appropriate start. But today my task is to make Samuel Beckett, despite that epigraph, become appealing and entertaining. And you can see from the picture here, this is Gary Oldman, the actor in the brilliant TV series that's ongoing called Slow Horses, where he plays a superannuated, borderline, almost about to be retired MI5 agent in London. And if there was ever an acting role designed for me, that would be it. Scruffy, dishevelled, disreputable. Anyway, and you can see from the photograph the tape recorder, as in the name of the play, Krapp's Last Tape, is a prominent feature. So I want to use that play today to explore the concept of technology and memory. And I'll use various aspects of painting, this theatrical production, photography, various literary references, and I want to try and explore the role that technology plays in memory. And given that we're on the cusp of an AI, artificial intelligence revolution, and what that will bring to our experience of human consciousness and memory, I think it's interesting to actually go back and look at a more primitive form of technology in which it's easier to see some of the early signs of how technology affects our way of thinking about ourselves. So this is the great man himself, and I was thinking to myself the other day, if Mount Rushmore you made a Samuel Beckett type face, you'd actually have to add yet more crenellations to the natural rock. Get busy with a chisel. It is a chiseled face, isn't it? But what I want to do is try and persuade you that actually he's a lot more fun than you might think. And you might think that's a bit of a stretch, but I think I mentioned the other day in a video the idea that Plato, if you read him with more of a sense of irony, I think he makes a lot more sense. And similarly with Beckett, I don't think you should take the misery at face value. I think I come from an Irish heritage, and I think there's an Irish sense of humour underlying a lot of what he does. It's about the absurdity of existence. And if you just adopt a slight wry sense of humour in your appreciation, I think it can do wonders, and just stops it being incredibly depressing. So, if I can share my own experience, the first time I remember encountering Beckett was Waiting for Godot. And it was, I think I must have been about 16, and in the 80s, it must have been, I'm trying to quickly do the maths, in the 1980s, TV in Britain was absolutely atrocious, and there's very little choice. I think I remember when Channel 4 came on, so you had ITV, independent television, and then you had BBC 1 and 2. So Channel 4 coming along, 4 channels, and it only came on about 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening. So it was slim pickings. And I think I was bored out of my school one day as a 16-year-old, and that's an interesting thing to explore one day. The way in which boredom has largely been taken out of people's lives because of the frenetic 24/7 pace of life today, and young people aren't really allowed to be bored. They can be miserable in lots of ways, but they're overstimulated, if anything, rather than understimulated. And anyway, I was watching this TV listlessly going between the 3 channels, And I didn't know what it was at the time, but I stumbled across the beginning of Waiting for Godot. And it's the actor, I've forgotten his name, but I think it was Rumpole the Bailey he starred in, so someone will remember it in the comments. And it was mesmerising in the fact it took the boredom I already had on Wii, if you want to use Beckett's French, and it just did something with it. It was so boring and so going nowhere and so aesthetically pointless and about pointlessness. It really drew me in, and I thought it was absolutely transfixing. So that was my first bizarre experience. And then not that well, it was about 5 years later. I was in America studying at U of Penn in Philadelphia, and we did what was called a drive away. We got a car that needed to go to the other side of the country, and ironically, I didn't drive, so I was driven by four other people in the car, and we drove from Philadelphia all the way to Los Angeles in about 7 or 8 days, I think it was. And I remember when we got to Los Angeles, I found it a very odd city, and I'm going to talk later on about the oppressiveness of light, because Krapp's last tape, to some extent, is about lightness, light, and darkness. It's quite Manichean. I think Beckett actually spoke about this in interviews. And anyway, got to Los Angeles. I found it a really weird, dispiriting place, and it was a friend of my friend was from Los Angeles, so he had various friends. So it was a friend of a friend was sat outside in this very brilliantly lit, sunlit apartment complex, very well off, swimming pool, and we're all just lounging around. And I have, again, I mentioned I'm from Irish background, so my skin is whiter than Dracula's bum. I do not do sun. So I just wandered off and found myself in my friend's dad's library. I had a brilliant library, and I became absorbed reading various books, and I think one of them was Beckett. And they came in looking for me eventually because I was away for ages, and I was happy as Larry in this dark, cool library, whilst they're all outside sunning themselves. And that just goes to my bizarre experience with Beckett is quite uplifting and pleasant in the midst of what could be a boring experience. So these are Krapp's last tape in 1958, and I want to compare it to. I'm just going to very quickly give you some visual representations of some of his other plays, and these are the dates that go with them. And why I'm doing this is because it's interesting. Krapp's last tape, I've mentioned the tape recorder. It's this physical presence on the desk, and I'll talk about the stage setting as we go along. But that is quite explicit and palpable, and throughout the play, Krapp interacts with the tape and he manually changes and edits and pauses and plays and fast forwards. And the whole point about tape is it can be edited. As the plays progress, increasingly, and by the way, he's playing back recordings of himself when he was younger. Every year on his birthday, he records a summary of what's gone on the year before, and in addition there are these various ledgers that he reads from that he summarised the past year in. But in these other plays, as time goes on, you hear voices, but there's no actual mechanical recording device involved. It becomes more and more ethereal, more and more ghost-like, wraith-like. And that's why I think Krapp's last tape is interesting, because in contemporary times, technology has become much more ethereal, abstract. It's less noticeable, it's less physical. Smartphones, online, flitting between screens. It's not the physicality of Krapp's last tape. And that's something I wanted to highlight. So, where were we? This play, Not I, That Time, Ohio Impromptu. I think it's like a kid's riddle, but I think the impetus for that title comes from the idea it's a kid's phrase, what's high in the middle and round at the ends, or the other alternative, what's high in the middle with nothing at the ends, and that's the word Ohio. So that obviously has symbolic significance for this notion of a life bookended by this beginning and end that's just this constant loop. So this is, excuse me, this is the first one. And this is the Alan Rickman version. I think it was a film, was it 2000-ish? Where there's him, his wife, and his mistress, all in these. I think is the other characters are Julia Stevenson and Kristen Scott Thomas, and they're in these funeral urns. And at the very end of at least the film version, you just see endless numbers of these urns and all these babbling voices. So it's quite eerie, and I'll probably overuse the word discombobulating today because that comes with the territory with Beckett. And talking about discombobulation, this is Not I, and I think one of his favourite actresses was Billie Whitelaw, and this is from the Royal Court Theatre in 1973. And the idea is there's a mouth behind the curtain and the scaffolding so that the mouth is high up, unfeasibly high for a human. So, but the actor or actress is hoisted up on the scaffolding, so that, but all you can see that's spotlit through the gap in the curtains is this mouth, and the whole performance is very short, but it's. I think Beckett's advice to an actor was that don't act and you can't go too fast, and by the end it's just this babbling stream of words. And if you ever catch it, there's a relatively modern film called just Samuel Beckett : Not I, and the actress, I'm struggling to remember her name. I think it's Lisa Dwan, Dwan, and it's all about her preparing for a performance of Not I, and it's mesmeric the way that she practices the lines. So she's sitting in the park and just starts practicing, and when you see the final thing, it's amazing. And this is it's a brilliant name. I'm assuming he's an Irish actor called Niall Buggy, and this is from the play That Time. And this time, it's not the actual actor who speaks; it's a recording of their own voice gets played back. I think it's at 3 different stages of their life, and at the very end, it's a big smiley face. And I think the stage directions from Beckett were smiley, big smile, preferably with no teeth. So anyone who's got false teeth takes them out at that point. And this is Jeremy Irons in Ohio Interrupted version. And as you can see, it's just very stark. And the premise behind this one is it's basically a doppelganger. There's a guy reading, and every time the other guy slams his hand on the table, the reader stops. So there's the reader and the listener. Very minimalistic. And finally, from Rockabye, again, this is Billie Whitelaw, and she listens to a recording of her own voice. That again, very eerie. But without more ado, let's look at Krapp's last tape, and I'll start off with the stage directions at the very beginning. So a late evening in the future, Krapp's den. Off-centre a small table, one drawer on side, audience right, unlocked, no keys. Sitting at the table, facing front, a wearish old man, Krapp. Rusty black narrow trousers too short for him, rusty black sleeveless waistcoat, 4 capacious pockets, heavy silver watch and chain, grimy white shirt open at neck, no collar, surprising pair of dirty white boots, size 10 at least, very narrow and pointed, white face, disordered grey hair, unshaven, very near-sighted but unspectacled, hard of hearing, cracked voice, distinctive intonation, laborious walk, table bare, table and immediately adjacent area in strong white light, rest of stage in darkness. So I'll be picking up on that light, strong white light and rest of stage in darkness. I think it's absolutely crucial. And as you can see earlier on as well, where are we? The dirty white boots, so white is important here. White face, black sleeveless waistcoat. There's contrast between black and white. Black narrow trousers. The black versus white is an important aspect of the whole thing. And this is from memory Stephen Rea, Rea, who I think's a Northern Irish actor. And you can see the black-white theme here and the very minimalist stage set. There's obviously differences in the way various directors interpret. Some interpret the stage directions very closely, and others, not so much. And this is Robert Wilson at the Barbican 2015. And I just want to emphasize, you can see this, the minimalism really accentuates the point about the tape recorder and the role of technology. And I'll keep going on about the light and the darkness, but in theatrical symbolic terms, the light represents him interacting with the technology. It's bringing to memory, into the light, all these things that he's said and done in the past. And when he goes off into the dark backstage, at one point you hear him, the stage directions are a cork pops, and he's obviously drinking, and I think there's a spray of soda as described in the stage directions. And he's also bizarrely addicted to bananas, which is a part of the more jokey, less serious element of it all. But this idea of going into the darkness, where that's more about the subconscious, that's more about where memories reside before they're brought out into the light. And what I'm going to pursue throughout this talk is the idea that the light, if you think of it in symbolic terms as linked to technology, the whole role of technology is to bring memory into the light. It's to expose everything. But the question I'm going to ask you is, or I am asking you, is to what extent does technology overexpose in photographic terms? To what extent does technology not allow an adequate amount of darkness, which is actually necessary, as I'll explore, in order to fully appreciate objects and memories? Too much light is as bad as too much darkness. You need what will be referred to by Hegel as the concept of determinate light. So without more ado, this is, I think, is a brilliant quote from Hegel's Science of Logic. But in fact, if one represents this seeing more exactly, one can easily become aware that in absolute clarity one sees just as much and as little as in absolute darkness. That the one seeing is as good as the other. That pure seeing is a seeing of nothing. Pure light and pure darkness are two voids which are the same thing. Something can be determined only in determinate light. So the definition of determinate, having exact or discernible limits or form. So there's this paradox that in order to actually have discernible form and to be able to make things out, whether that's actual physical objects or memories, you need determinate light, not limitless darkness or limitless light. The excessiveness of too much light or too much darkness are actually counterproductive. And then in terms of artists, I've done a material in the past early on in the channel's career where I looked at Edward Hopper, and we'll be going back to him because borderline obsessed with him. But I just think of all the artists I can think of who engage with the notion of light and darkness and the notion of determinate light, I think Hegel could have been writing about Edward Hopper. Even the shadows of the road alongside the building, I just think it's brilliantly done. And if later on I'll show a picture of this is called New York Office from 1962, but there's a painting called Automat, which I think is 1927, and just remember the lights receding at the top. He does that more so in Automat, which is an earlier painting. And then I don't think this is one of his more popular paintings, but I think Gas, this is called Gas from 1940. And just this notion of determinate light, there's something eerie in the woods. I just think it's amazing. There's something evocative, there's something atmospheric about this. And just to repeat what this has to do, I'm trying to give you visual representations of this idea that I think is implicit in the play Krapp's Last Tape. The relationship of light and darkness. And when things are made too light, meaning is lost. When things are too dark, meaning is lost. I think a major element of Krapp's Last Tape is this tension between the two, between lightness and darkness. And it's interesting, I mentioned, I think I mentioned earlier, the Manichaean aspect, the notion of light and darkness. And in the Manichaean tradition, the idea is you try and make everything light. Darkness is the demiurge, darkness is bad, and you're searching for the Gnostic light. I think Beckett's against that. Beckett is much more about you can't have one without the other. Too much light, too much darkness. There's the human realm of in between. And to repeat, with things like artificial intelligence and with technologies like that, you're veering towards the too much light. Whereas this type of art, the balance, the tension, everything's in the tension between the light and the dark. And to give you a different format, so this is Edward Hopper's beautiful painting, but this is Cindy Sherman. She did a series called Untitled Film Stills. I think this is number 48. Was it 77 to 80? Apologies if I've misremembered. I think it was a 3-year period, 1977 to 80, that she shot these. But she's like emulating film noir. And then this concept, I think you see it in Edward Hopper's paintings. This is obviously a black and white photograph, but it's also obviously done on a very sunny day. And the way Cindy Sherman captures the shadows. This is, again, Untitled Film Still number 44. And I'm no artist, so anyone who's much more creative than me, I hope or I'm guessing would appreciate this use of, Hegel talks about determinate light. The way in which Cindy Sherman here is capturing, you don't get the solidity of the building without the contrast of the shadows. They're just, this later on, I think I'll show you some Giorgio de Chirico, which I can't stop myself. But this is, again, the use of shadows, the light versus darkness. And this is seemingly, this is quite an innocuous photograph in lots of ways. You'd think the main subject is the woman coming down the stairs in, stylish garb. But again, maybe it's just me. I'm obsessed with shadows, but the way in the shadows in the background. Let's put it this way. I don't think anyone photographed shadows as well as Cindy Sherman did. So remember, I'm talking about, this is what I think great art does. It gets the balance, the tension between the dark and the light. That's why I think Krapp's Last Tape is brilliant. It's about Krapp moving around on stage, coming from the darkness into the light and back again. And obviously the audience is in the dark, metaphorically and literally in some ways. But to pursue this notion of technology as being excessive light, this is, they are a series of prison buildings in Cuba. It's the Presidio Modelo. And they're a practical example of the what's called the Panopticon design. And I think it was originally called the Isla de Pinos, the Isle of Pines. And now it's called the Isla de la Juventud. Sorry, put my teeth back on. Juventud, youth. So if you notice the obvious circularity, and then this is the inside. And it's based, the idea is based on an old, well, say old idea, but Jeremy Bentham, I think it was around about 1787, he went to see his brother who was working in the Russian Empire at the time. And his brother had this idea of trying to observe his workers at all times, which gave Jeremy Bentham this idea of a prison model. So the original idea was observing workers, and Bentham adapted it. And the word panopticon's Greek for all-seeing. And you can just see it's a very basic but clever design. By one central observation post, you can see the maximum number of people. And the backlighting provides lots of light, but also anyone in the cells can't hide. But the analogy I'm making is the idea that this is a technologically inspired design. It's a technical solution to the desire to shed as much possible light, in this case on prisoners. This is what technology does. And this is another view. And if you could just pay attention to the roofing and the way there's like a scaffolding structure. If you'll forgive me, because I'm doing something on, this video is all about Samuel Beckett, and he does some quite random associations in his work, so forgive me. But earlier on in the channel, I did a video about the Metropolitan Cathedral in Liverpool, and if you look at that and then look at that, call me mad, but it's what reminded me. Two completely different uses for light. And the crown of thorns, you can almost see it at the top. But anyway, so these are physical instantiations. These are physical embodiments of this desire to shed as much light as possible. I'll give you a slightly different example now from media. This is the production suite for the Spanish version of the Big Brother reality TV series. I think in Spain it's called Gran Hermano, big, their version of Big Brother. I think it was called Gran Hermano VIP. So this panopticon of all these cameras recording absolutely everything that goes on in the house. But just to remind you of the inside of the Metropolitan Cathedral. And one interesting, just a by note on this, the number of people online who've said to me they don't like this, what they would consider brutalist architecture. And if you compare and contrast that with, I don't think I've ever spoken to anyone who's been to the building in person and didn't like it. But there's a significant number of people, a percentage of people don't like it, having never actually visited it. And that made me think about the difference between the actual relationship between memory and felt experience, and memory and technologically mediated experience. Increasingly in our lives, we see so much that we haven't somatically felt. We haven't felt through our bodies or had personal direct experience. And just to keep repeating, with something like artificial intelligence, that's just going to get worse and worse. But when you see this building in person, the scale, it sounds daft, but just the absolute amount of cubic meters of air that's around you, the way that affects how sound travels within that building, the constantly changing light from the spire, and as you walk around, it's a perfect circle. The sunlight will come in at a different angle, and it's different coloured stained glass, and you'll see different colours. You can get a sense of that from looking on the floor. It's a truly stunning building to be in. And yet, like I say, a lot of people, just by looking at it, don't like it. And again, my loose association, but remembering my memory of that pattern is like, I've been to that cathedral so many times. But I had this implant on my head of this when I was looking at the Gran Hermano pictures of the TV production suite. This is a schematic of the various cameras and how they're linked on the network. But anyway, it's an insight into my bizarre labyrinthine mind. And we'll just say goodbye to the cathedral as we leave. But back to Beckett. Early on in his career, he wrote this essay, Proust, from I think it was 1930. Breathing is habit, life is habit, or rather, life is a succession of habits, since the individual is a succession of individuals, the world being a projection of the individual's consciousness. The pact must be continually renewed, the letter of safe conduct brought up to date. The creation of the world did not take place once and for all time, but takes place every day. Habit then is the generic term for the countless treaties concluded between the countless subjects that constitute the individual and their countless correlative objects. So a number of things to say on this. I think I used as an epigraph a few videos ago a quote from Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who said something about you're born again, you give birth to yourself every day. You're not just born once, which is very similar to what Beckett's saying here. And the idea, it's interesting, Beckett wrote this about Proust in 1930, and I think later on in life he disassociated himself, not from the concepts he's expressing, but I think he thought it was quite pompous and philosophical, this particular essay. Like I said, very early in his career. But the idea of breathing is habit, when he eventually does the play Breath in 1969, I think the main performance that I saw was 35 seconds, but I think it's been done as quickly as 25 seconds. It's basically a baby crying. I think the technical word is it vagitus? The crying of a baby being born. So the baby cries, there's heavy breathing, and then the baby cries again. And that's the end. And then this idea of habit. Throughout this essay that Beckett wrote about Proust, the concept of habit. And it made me think, when you introduce technology into the equation, there's one thing having habit as a physically embodied part of your environment. You have certain physical habits, you have certain habitual ways of interacting with the world. Again, the question I've been increasingly thinking about, what happens when technology becomes the habit? How does that potentially undermine what Beckett is writing about here? So in some senses, habit is all about low-key activity. It's about repetition. It's about familiarity. And again, I'd argue it's part of the tension between lightness and darkness. But what happens when the low-key, this tension between light and dark, the way you live your life, what happens when the technology encourages total light, too much exposure? And in a sense, I think that's what celebrities, that's the life they lead, which I can honestly say I wouldn't have if it was offered to me. And the way young people, increasingly, their whole life is online. Their whole life is exposed to the light. They've made that Cuban prison, the Panopticon, that's what their life is now, largely due to technology. And then the question is, and what does that do to people's memories? So this is John Hurt in Krapp's last tape at the Barbican in London in 1999. So again, in the same essay, Beckett says, a childhood that involuntary memory stimulated or charmed by the long-forgotten taste of a madeleine steeped in an infusion of tea conjures in all the relief and colour of its essential significance from the shallow well of a cup's inscrutable banality. So in light of the previous quote about habit, a major element, I covered this, it's been covered in the Proust book club, and I did a whole video with the madeleine soaked in tea as the thumbnail. But this idea that such an insignificant act, eating a bit of tea-soaked cake, it's habitual, it's what he used to do. And that is one of the most famous, one of the most evocative, one of the most influential little vignettes from Proust's whole work. And I love this phrase that Beckett uses, from the shallow well of a cup's inscrutable banality. The point being, from banality, great art can come. But what happens in a technological world when that type of very organic, natural, inscrutable banality has been expunged by the excessive exposure of the bright light of technology? There's no relief anymore. There's no figures emerging out of darkness combined with light. Everything is exposed too much. This is Michael Gambon in 2010, I think. And I think I read somewhere that Gary Oldman's production used the same tape recorder that was used in this. Bit of trivia there. So carrying on from this notion of involuntary memory, the Madeleine type thing that's in Proust, this is again from the essay on Proust by Beckett. From this janal, trinal, agile monster or divinity, time, a condition of resurrection because an instrument of death, habit, an infliction insofar as it opposes the dangerous exaltation of the one, and a blessing insofar as it palliates the cruelty of the other. Memory, a clinical laboratory stocked with poison and remedy, stimulant and sedative. So I mentioned earlier on the tension between light and darkness. For Beckett, involuntary memory that Proust writes about is all about the tension of those three things: time, habit, and memory. And I'm sorry if I keep banging on about it, but I just want to keep this theme of technology and memory going all the way through. But technology doesn't tend to sponsor tension. Time, habit, memory in a work of art can be closely bound together in this creative form of tension. Technology doesn't do that. Technology exposes, technology shows excessive light, sheds excessive light upon things. And this is Stephen Rea again. So this is my explanation from my own notes of that time, habit, memory, trinal, Janal, from the idea of Janus, the god of the two-faced god looking both backwards and forwards. For Beckett, the significance of Proust's work comes from his ability to depict the deeply intertwined yet also oppositional elements within life and its intractable fatefulness. I feel a bit like Krapp now, looking back at my own writing, thinking, what did he bloody mean by that? Time, habit, and memory are three aspects of how human beings experience life, but all three aspects also contain internal tensions. Time is simultaneously the medium within which life takes place, and also the vehicle through which that same life inevitably ends. Habit, too much and our life risks becoming ossified by losing all sense of dangerous exaltation. But habit can also anchor us with comforting reference points, palliative islands, and an otherwise cruel sea. I was in particularly florid, verbose mood that day. Memory, also deeply ambivalent. It acts as both poison and remedy, stimulant and sedative. Our memories both sustain and haunt us. And that haunting, I think there's a quote later on in the play about shades. And remember, the Romans had this concept of shades as ghosts. That's what they called ghosts. But the way in which, I just find it interesting, shades drawing upon the concept of shade and light and darkness. The things that haunt us come from the shaded world. And again, I just ask you to think, to what extent does technology override these nuanced qualities of human life? This is F. Murray Abraham, actor. I recognise the face, but I can't remember what he's been in, so apologies. But to comment upon the actual physicality of the tape recorder, Krapp switches off in order to look up a word or to brood, to go off for drink, or simply to wind forward or back. To get what he wants, he plays, skips, plays again, winds back and repeats. In short, he edits. The physical act of this process is insisted upon in the stage directions, and in Beckett's own productions of the play, close attention was always paid to the gross materiality of the recorder and the tapes, their weight, their noise, their bulk, their sheer awkwardness. These are the recalcitrant objects the editor must manipulate. Yeah, I think it was the play All That Fall. He produced it for the BBC in, I think it was the year before Krapp's last tape, so it would be 57. And when they played him the tapes of All That Fall, that's when he got the idea for Krapp's last tape, because he saw the tape recorder in action. The tape recordings, the objective epitome of Krapp's recollections, are less passive than they seem. While the tape allows Krapp to replay the unforgettable moments of his life as many times as he likes, at the same time, it ruthlessly and vividly reminds him of his youthful ambitions and of the chances of happiness he has lost. With all the taped voices' self-persuading declaration after it admits that the 39-year-old Krapp is past his prime years, he says, I wouldn't want them back. They do come back to Krapp again and again, for his tapes can repeat his memories precisely and endlessly. By projecting his subjective recollections onto objective records, Krapp has thrown himself into a self-created purgatory. And if the tape recorder can create a self-created purgatory, imagine how much more digital technology, what that does to memory. Talk about a self-created purgatory. Back to the actual play where he says, the new light above my table is a great improvement. I think this is the 39-year-old Krapp, forgive me if I've misremembered. So he's hearing this in the tape. The new light above my table is a great improvement. With all this darkness around me, I feel less alone. Pause. In a way, pause. I love to get up and move about in it. Then back here to, hesitates, me. Krapp. So this thing about light and darkness, the light makes him feel less alone. But then he also likes to go back into the darkness where he has privacy, his subconscious, he can be himself. Or sorry, he can not over obsess about himself. And then he comes back to, and then he hesitates and says, me. And again, this notion of digital technology, people can't escape their memories because nothing ever dies on the cloud or in the cloud. And people can't escape. There are less and less escape routes from yourself in a heavily technologized digital world. So with regards to the tape and the light above it, there's still the light-dark tension. But if that's digital technology, it'd be much more like the Panopticon prison in Cuba, where it's total light. Just been listening to an old year, passages at random. I did not check in the book, but it must be at least 10 or 12 years ago. At that time, I think I was still living on and off with Bianca in Kedar Street. Well out of that. Jesus, yes. Hopeless business. Not much about her apart from a tribute to her eyes. Very warm. I suddenly saw them again. Incomparable. Ah, well. So he's listening to himself again. I think this is the 39-year-old. And it's interesting, this is the subtlety of the black and white. So Bianca in Spanish is white. Blanco, but there's this concept of whiteness. And Kedar, I've read, I think the biographer of Beckett said that Kedar is dark, Darke, in as an anagram. But also I think Kedar in Hebrew means the dark one. I think Kedar, Qadar, is Hebrew for to become dark. But anyway, this whiteness versus darkness. And the way, remember from the stage directions, the fact that it's the waistcoat and the white shirt, the white and the black. And the next bit's really poignant. He's talking about when he was by a canal, and I think his mother's house, this is from the play, his mother's house is behind him. And there's lots, I don't have time to go into it, there's lots of autobiographical truth behind this, because he had a complex relationship with his own mother. But this is Krapp experiencing the death of his own mother. Benched by the weir from where I could see her window, there I sat in the biting wind, wishing she were gone. Hardly a soul, just a few regulars, nursemaids, infants, old men, dogs. I got to know them quite well. Oh, by appearance, of course, I mean. One dark again with the darkness, young beauty, I recollect particularly, all white, again the whiteness, and starch, incomparable bosom, with a big black hooded perambulator, most funereal thing. Whenever I looked in her direction, she had eyes on me, and yet when I was bold enough to speak to her, not having been introduced, she threatened to call a policeman, as if I had designs on her virtue. The face she had, the eyes, like chrysolite. Ah, well, I was there when. And then it stage directions, Krapp switches off, Brood switches on again. I think the chrysolite's it's a word used in Othello, so we've stolen that from Shakespeare. But you can see all the way through the dark versus the light. It's an intrinsic part of the description. And then he talks about, and this is interesting because in the play Krapp's Last Tape, he describes Krapp having a revelation. And in the play, Krapp quickly passes over listening to himself talk about the revelation. And as we'll see shortly, he keeps replaying. He has an encounter in a boat, a romantic encounter with a woman. And he keeps replaying that. So what you can deduce from that is that the young Krapp that's quite pompous, he thinks he's very creative, he's going to sacrifice his life to be a famous writer. He has a revelation that the older Krapp disdains, has obviously moved on from, and doesn't believe in that revelation. In real life, Beckett had a revelation, which I'll talk about shortly, but it wasn't dramatic. It had a dramatic effect on his career, but it wasn't dramatic. So he's presented this revelation I'm about to describe that Krapp has dramatically, while simultaneously having something that had a dramatic effect, but it didn't happen dramatically. I think Beckett's revelation took place in his mother's room. Spiritually, a year of profound gloom and indigence until that memorable night in March at the end of the jetty in the howling wind, never to be forgotten, when suddenly I saw the whole thing, the vision at last. This, I fancy, is what I have chiefly to record this evening, against the day when my work will be done, and perhaps no place left in my memory, warm or cold, for the miracle that, for the fire that set it alight. What I suddenly saw then was this, that the belief I had been going on all my life, namely, Krapp switches off impatiently, winds tape forward, mechanical winding, 2 seconds, gabble, switches on again. So this is what I mean about he just rejects this great revelation. So he's, alone in the world without the solace of the revelation. This is James Hayes from 2020. So I mentioned his own revelation. This is from his biography, and I love the title, "Damned to Fame." Very Beckett-like. In speaking of his own revelation, Beckett tended to focus on the recognition of his own stupidity. So these are Beckett's words. "Malloy and the others came to me on the day I became aware of my own folly. Only then did I begin to write the things I feel. And on his concern with importance." Sorry, that should say impotence. There's actually a joke that's based upon a pun between importance and impotence. That. I think Beckett would approve of that. Sorry, that word important should say impotence. Looking very impotent. Nile Buggy again. So Beckett goes on to explain what he meant. "I realised that Joyce, so James Joyce was a close friend of Beckett's, had gone so far as one could in the direction of knowing more, being in control of one's material. He was always adding to it. You only have to look at his proofs to see that. I realised that my own way was in impoverishment, in lack of knowledge, and in taking away, in subtracting rather than in adding." So I'm trying to remember James Joyce. Finnegan's Wake, he was writing, apparently. I think his wife said James Joyce was writing Finnegan's Wake. It's the type of thing I'd do. And he was laughing hysterically at his own jokes. he would say things like, "Oh, let the critics work this one out." And Ulysses, Finnegan's Wake, Joyce's taking authorial control to the nth degree. So we did it throughout the whole of Ulysses. Very, very complex, erudite, obscure references. And he almost made it a badge of honor that he wanted to keep critics busy for the next, 100 years trying to work out all the illusions that he was writing about. And what Beckett did, his revelation, it's just pure Beckett. His revelation was his path to genius lay. It sounds like the Seinfeld episode, the pitch, the TV series about nothing. Beckett realized his strength lay in very little, which is something I admire and aspire to myself. So, in lack of knowledge and taking away and subtracting rather than adding. And I think that matches the minimalist sets that are used in Krapp's last tape. So this is about the revelation. This next section I'm going to read you it's the end of the revelation, and then Krapp is rejecting the revelation and fast forwards to his romantic encounter in the boat. Great granite rocks, the foam flying up in the light of the lighthouse and the wind gauge spinning like a propeller. Clear to me at last that the dark I've always struggled to keep under is in reality my most. Krapp curses, switches off, winds tape forward. Mechanical winding, 3 seconds, gabble, switches on again. Unshatterable association until my dissolution of storm and night with the light of the understanding and the fire. Krapp curses louder, switches off, winds tape forward. Mechanical winding, 4 seconds, gabble. All other manipulations manual, switches on again. My face and her breasts and my hand on her. We lay there without moving, but under us all moved, and moved us gently up and down and from side to side. Past midnight. Never knew such silence. The earth might be uninhabited. Here I end. So the memories, at least on the tape recorder, he's fast forwarded through the memory of the revelation, and he's had the additional revelation that the revelation didn't amount to anything. And then he has the much fonder, wistful memory, the one he wants to keep going back to. I think he goes back to the romantic tryst section 3 times in the play. One element in particular, the Krapp passage, relates it, however, directly to Beckett's own experience. The darkness of an inner world was indeed an image that Beckett reproduced with friends to whom he spoke about his revelation. Beckett explained precisely what he meant by this part of Krapp's vision, writing that the dark was in reality my most lost, my most precious ally, meaning his true element at last and key to the opus magnum. Light was therefore rejected in favour of darkness, and this darkness can certainly be seen as extending to a whole zone of being that includes folly and failure, importance and ignorance. I'm convinced that should say impotence, but I don't know on earth how I've managed to... It really is, that's the definition of a Freudian slip. I've twice transliterated importance and impotence. I obviously need to go off for therapy. But I just think if you think of how oppositional, how antithetical this is, Beckett's philosophy on life to the current philosophy. So Beckett's embraced the darkness, folly, failure, impotence and ignorance. But think of the Instagram perfect life. Everyone's presenting on Facebook and places their perfect families, their perfect holidays, and the pressure to keep up appearances and the fear of missing out. I just think the embracing of the tape recorder tells its own story. And this is another example of so I'm showing you the physical relationship he has with the tape recorder and then what's related on the tape. Up a lake with the punt, bathed off the bank, then pushed out into the stream and drifted. She lay stretched out on the floorboards with her hands under her head and her eyes closed. Sun blazing down, bit of a breeze, water nice and lively. I noticed a scratch on her thigh and asked her how she came by it. Picking gooseberries, she said. I don't believe her. I said again I thought it was hopeless and no good going on, and she agreed without opening her eyes. I asked her to look at me, and after a few moments she did, but the eyes just slits because of the glare. I bent over her to get them in the shadow, and they opened. And I think that's crucial. He has to make shadow, i.e. darkness, for her to be able to open her eyes, because otherwise the light is too excessive. Let me in. We drifted among the flags and stuck. The way they went down, sighing before the stem. I lay down across her with my face in her breasts and my hand on her. We lay there without moving, but under us all moved us gently up and down and from side to side. Past midnight, never knew. So you don't have to be a Freudian expert to see some of the allusions in the way the reeds go down, sighing before the stem. Not Samuel at his most subtle. But let me in. The idea he wants to be let into her eyes, and also obviously more sexual connotations as well. But I just think that's a brilliant section where, like I say, sorry to repeat myself, but he makes the shadow so she can open her eyes, which in the light, deliberate pun of everything I've been saying about light and darkness, I think this is a great illustration. This is Patrick McGee as Krapp embracing his tape recorder. This is at the National Portrait Gallery in London, I think. And then the humour, I do find this funny. Just been listening to that stupid bastard I took myself for 30 years ago. Hard to believe I was ever as bad as that. The voice, Jesus. Thank God that's all done with anyway. The eyes she had. He broods, realises he's recording silence, switches off, broods, finally. Everything there, everything, all there. Realises this is not being recorded, switches on. Everything there, everything on this old muckball. All the light and dark and famine and feasting of the ages. And this idea of self-alienation comes up. So he encounters in his own notes, or the recorded voice, viduity, the word viduity, which means, I'm trying to remember, I think it means a period of being a widow or a widower. And he, as he's older, forgets what the word means. He has to look it up in a dictionary. So this is a comment upon that as an illustration of alienation. His estrangement from his younger self is most acutely shown in the scene about the word viduity. The old man's reaction to the word is exaggeratedly physical. He gives a start upon hearing the word, goes off stage and brings back a huge dictionary to consult. Here his alienation from what he was is cruelly embodied by the fact that Krapp now simply does not understand the meaning of the word. In other words, his distance from what he once was is concretized in the now unknown word, and the strong and rather pompous voice which utters it. Furthermore, the playwright's subtle choice of the word makes Krapp agitation about viduity echo his own widowhood from his former self. But returning to the memory of his mother's death, the blind went down, one of those dirty brown roller affairs, throwing a ball for a little white dog, as chance would have it. I happened to look up, and there it was, all over and done with at last. I sat on for a few minutes with the ball in my hand and the dog yelping and pawing at me. Moments. Her moments. My moments. The dog's moments. In the end, I held it out to him and he took it in his mouth, gently, gently. A small, old, black, hard, solid rubber ball. I shall feel it in my hand until my dying day. I might have kept it, but I gave it to the dog. Oh well. I just find that fascinating, the idea of the old, black, hard, solid rubber ball. That for the rest of his life, it's that completely contingent detail, that little physical object that stands out on that memorable day when his mother dies and the blind gets drawn down to signal to him outside. And again, with the white dog and the black ball, the white and the dark. And forgive the over-literal illustration to follow. But this was an artist, Yvonne Wendell. I think she's German. And the ball was put in various locations in the Black Forest. I think it was an art festival called Ornamenta in 2024. And I think it's felt, so I think it's incredibly light. But the physicality of a random object is the point that this artist is trying to make, and it's the point that Beckett made. Much more physical. This is Black Sphere by Gene Heistein, and it's at the University of Chicago. And I'll just finish with the concept of shade, because I want to bring together all the ideas. I've been talking about a play, and I did start off talking about Hegel's notion of determinate light and how that could be applied to seeing. But in this book, Shades of Painting at the Limit, John Sallis, who was an American philosopher, died not that long ago. It's a fascinating book, and if you're artistic, if you're a visual artist, I'm sure, I don't know, but I'm guessing it would be much more familiar to you than me, the notion that shade, paradoxically, gives life to a painting is throughout this book. This is what John Sallis argues. So talking about shade, it is not just palpable but indeed elemental, in the sense in which fire and earth are elemental. Shade gives relief from the direct sunlight, from its blazing, blinding effects. Shade gives relief. As such, the word may name either the shadow cast by something that blocks the direct sunlight, or by extension, the object itself, especially when the shade is something fabricated from an opaque material. And remember, in that section where he's with the woman in the boat, Krapp takes on the embodiment of shade itself, the relief to the woman's eyes that he provides himself. If cast within an illuminated expanse, rather than enclosing an interior, shade gives relief also in the sense of outlining an area or shape sharply contrasted with the sunlit surroundings, and thus, even in what one may take as pure nature, it foreshadows the mode of sculpture in which forms and figures are distinguished from a surrounding plane surface the mode in which they are shown, as one says, in relief. And why I'm quoting from this is John Sallis, throughout his book, persuasively argues that this is what painting does when it's at its best. This notion of giving objects relief. And it just made me think in terms of technology and memory. It's the problem I have with anime. It's the problem I have with modern animation. It lacks this relationship between light and darkness. It's too clean. It's too bright. It's too manufactured. And it's when you watch, disturbingly, I keep accidentally watching AI videos on YouTube because you think they're a real video initially, and then you realize very quickly, and there's something just off about it. I just think it's interesting to contrast that notion of a technologically produced image or video compared to a genuine artistic production. And the paintings, I always is my go-to painter for this type of shadow versus light, but Giorgio de Chirico. If you think of that, those two paragraphs together, I think you couldn't get a much better painter to summarize that than de Chirico. So this is the Soothsayer's Recompense from 1913. And in terms of technology, I love the anachronism. So you've got the train in the background. His father was a train engineer. So I think Giorgio had a thing about choo-choo trains. But you've also got the clock at the apex of the pavilion. A classical statue, a train. So in some sense, it's like it's not aged. It looks timeless, but then there are implications of time. And you've got the weird thing, the flags are flying to the left, the steam on the trains going to the right. This is called the Red Tower from 1913 by de Chirico. And again with the shadows. And I find this interesting because we're deep, as the viewer, you're deep within the shadow looking out into the brightness. So just to remind you, but in fact, if one represents this saying more exactly, just to re-quote this Hegel, one can easily become aware that in absolute clarity one sees just as much and as little in absolute darkness, that the one seeing is as good as the other. The pure seeing is a seeing of nothing. Pure light and pure darkness are two voids which are the same thing. Something can be determined only in determinate light. And I understand that I've gone from different format, different medium of art to different medium of art. But the common thread I'm arguing is that in Krapp's last tape, this black and white, lightness and darkness, it illustrates this Hegelian philosophical approach, but it also underpins what great artists do, visual artists. So this is Giorgio de Chirico, Mystery and Melancholy of a Street from 1914. And it's potentially my favourite one by him. It's just the weird, the dark, threatening nature of the shadow at the top. The weirdly placed truck. The porticos in shadow that go off at an oblique angle. Just very, very odd and menacing. This is called The Enigma of the Hour. But the point of showing all these, Only where there is shade can anything be seen. Only through the operation of shade does there arise contour, outline, delimitation form itself. The very configuration of self-showing as such, which solicits and directs the vision that comes to sweep across things. Painting is determined by the absolute imperative of shading. For the painter, everything depends on communication with the shading, with the raising into relief through which things come to show themselves. In a self-showing, that is their very emergence into presence. Now, in terms of Krapp's last tape, he's forcing it with the tape. He's not allowing their very emergence into presence. And again, at the risk of boring you senseless, the idea that with technology, digital technology, this forcing, this not allowing their very emergence into presence is exacerbated. It gets worse, not better. In the digital world, where's the shade? Is my rhetorical question. And I'd struggle to explain precisely why, but I think this is potentially my favourite Edward Hopper painting. I think it's the way he manages to combine, it's the oppressiveness of the sun, which I've always thought I much prefer winter and autumn. I find summer like this, I find this much more oppressive than any dark winter's day because of this contrast. It's hard to explain, but the way the shadows go so deep into the shop front, it's brilliantly done. I think this is called Early Sunday Morning from 1930. And then remember when I said the New York office painting, this was a much earlier one from 1927, automat, but the way which the lights recede. It's just this way in which I don't think this is a million miles. This is obviously a visual format. I don't think it's a million miles from what Beckett, in a certain sense, is doing in Krapp's last tape. The loneliness of someone and the use of light and darkness. So this is Hotel Window from 1955. And this might all seem a bit abstract because they're just paintings, but to show you the practical effect, this was House by the Railroad, 1925. And just to show I'm not imagining the dark, the menacing quality of Hopper's work, that for some people, I'm guessing, it's just a house in a bit of shadow and bright sunlight. But I believe this was one of the influences on Hitchcock for the house in Psycho. So I'm not alone. I think Alfred and I shared a certain appreciation of Edward Hopper. In consorting with the shades, and remember that Roman use of the word shades as ghosts, the painter's orientation is not toward representation, neither toward representing darkness by way of shading, nor toward representing objects by mimetic reproduction, in other words, copying. What the painter brings forth is shading itself, its operation, the mixing of light and shade, through which, in which, from which, by way of which, none of these prepositional phrases suffices alone, nor perhaps even together, to express this most subtle yet most decisive hinge. Things come to show themselves in their delimitation. So this is the paradox of art, good art. Good art expresses itself through the limitations of the artistic form it's chosen. So Beckett has chosen a minimalist stage setting, one man with a tape recorder, and he achieves from that self-imposed limitation It's the opposite of a Hollywood film with special effects and all that money invested. The mixing of light and shade. So to finish with a couple of images, this is Caravaggio, The Calling of St. Matthew. I think it's circa 1599 to 1600. So the message here is the light coming in and shedding light in the darkness. This is Joseph Wright of Derby, and it's called An Experiment on a Bird and the Air Pump from 1768. So this is quite... I think this is a brilliant painting because you've got the Gothic moon outside. You've got the bird that's being suffocated for the purposes of a scientific experiment. And you've got the chiaroscuro, the light and darkness that I've been talking about throughout the whole video. And it's expressing the concept of the Enlightenment. This is scientific knowledge that helped us progress. But there's a dark edge to it. So the two images I've just shown you are all about light being shed on. So one's a religious theme, and now you have the scientific theme, but light is being shed into somewhere where otherwise there was darkness. You could still see some, even though there's a dark edge to this, there's still some optimism. But what's interesting is this is a picture from, I think this was Tottenham versus Juventus. So this is a English, as North Americans would say, soccer match. And this is the crowd at a game. They've paid a fortune for their tickets. And I call it the spell checker paradox, because when I was finishing teaching, I noticed that never has a generation had less excuse for making spelling errors because they have spell checker on their computers. And yet, never had I encountered a generation so pathologically incapable of spelling. And here you have a generation that are absolutely wedded to their phones. They can't directly experience. Never has a generation had so much chance of accessing reality through various representations, to the point that they can't even go to a live sporting event without experiencing it through their phones. So the technology that's supposed to give you the most, like the spell checker in this instance, is removing your ability to actually experience any reality at all that's not mediated. And I'll just finish with this before I go off into a Samuel Beckett-like rant, or Krapp rant. I'll finish with an image from, I think it's the Stephen Rea performance of Krapp's last tape. And why I sometimes lose faith in humanity. I know it's not the biggest sin in the world, but just look at that Wally at the bottom of the picture, filming the stage through his device. You'd think that someone attending a play as reflexive about technology and memory could avoid the temptation to film. When's he ever going to watch this? What memories is he going to have of the theatre? Just sit and enjoy the actual play about a man who didn't learn the lesson of lost memories and could only try and recapture them through the deadness of a tape recorder. And this guy's looking through his mobile phone, even at Krapp's last tape. And on that cheery note, until the next time, all the very best. Take care.